Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everybody. We'll be starting in less than 1 minute. Good day, everybody, and welcome to the next and the last of the third in the series of GIS mapping and hotspot identification webinars presented by analysts for the Texas Department of Transportation. This one called Identifying and Analyzing Hotspots for DDACTS. I'm Mark Demisho, the Grants and Accreditation Manager at IADLEST, the International Association of Directors of Land Enforcement Standards and Training, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. You can find more about it by going to IADLEST, by going to www.iadlest.org. And this webinar series is made possible by a grant from TxDOT, the Texas Department of Transportation. The intent is to continue efforts to raise awareness in the law enforcement community of the need to find ways to reduce not just crimes, but also crash rates, since the rates of crashes far outpaces the rates of crime. It's part of TxDOT's effort for a statewide implementation of the nationally recognized data-driven approaches to crime and traffic safety, DDACTS, within the state. Now, this is a hands-on webinar, folks, and so each one of you should be at your own workstation, not multiple users at one workstation. We can only track one user at a time, and that'll help also later when you try to register for the test at the end. It won't recognize you if you haven't registered for the webinar. It works best if you're on two screens, one for the broadcast itself and one for the information that the Allen material that we asked you to download earlier. If not available, find the biggest monitor you can and then split that screen and you should be able to do fine. Now, just a few other housekeeping things as we go forward. Now, your microphone's going to be muted, and so we can't hear what's going on back at your computer or back at your agency. So, consequently, if you have a question, and we do really ask you to send us your questions about something that may tickle your interest during the webinar, you can do that on a couple of different methods. The first thing is to go over to the questions toolbar and just type it in on the question there. I'll see that and I'll try to get it answered for you. The other thing you can do is type it in the chat section of the toolbar, or you can also use the raise your hand feature. This one works real well also. The raise your hand feature will key me to probably just respond back to you and ask you what your question is, and we'll get it taken care of that way. But you have three different ways to get a hold of me to make sure your question is answered. And if none of those work, if I'm asleep at the switch here, you can always give me a call on the phone at area code 316-640-6513, and we'll get your questions taken care of. Now, there are two handouts in the handouts area of the toolbar today for you. One is called Hotspot Identification Handout.pdf, and the other one is CrimeStat3 Workbook.pdf. Both of those will be very instrumental in this webinar. The Hotspot Identification handout will kind of follow along with the presentation as it goes along, and the CrimeStat3 Workbook is a very good and helpful guide for you. One thing that we couldn't load because of its size is the Allen GIS folder, which was also part of this webinar. Now, about an hour ago, I sent you all a link that you needed to do to download the Allen GIS folder. If you didn't do it, there is the link on your screen. And what I'm going to do as soon as I get done talking here, go ahead and take a look at your chat box, because I will be sending you the link to this on Dropbox, and then you can go into the Dropbox and download it for yourself so you'll have it for the presentation. Just give me a second after I finish talking and I toss it over to Christopher. Now, the test at the end, I'll give you information at the end about how to take the test and receive your course certificate. And with that, it's my pleasure to once again call back to the screen Christopher Bruce. Christopher was a crime analyst for 17 years in Massachusetts, first for the Danvers Police Department and then Cambridge, Massachusetts Police Department. Throughout his career, he's been extremely active in the crime analysis community as president of the International Association of Crime Analysts for 2 terms, as the vice president of the IACA, and currently he sits as the vice president, what is it, Christopher, vice president of membership?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And he's also been president of the Massachusetts Association of Crime Analysts. He frequently provides conference presentations on crime analysis and week-long training classes on topics such as crime mapping, spatial statistics, and the Microsoft Office applications. Now, since 2011, he's been the analytical director for the IADLIST NHTSA DDACTS project, and since 2014, he's been the program manager for the IADLIST BJA Crime Analysis project, and in both cases, providing workshops, training, and technical assistance across the country. He also works on a variety of other contracts for governmental and nonprofit programs, including currently with the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, and he has taught graduate and undergraduate classes at Tiffin University and Western Oregon University. And when he's not on the road, he enjoys the view of the harbor from his home in Stockton Springs, Maine, and that's where he joins us today. So with that, I will toss it over to you, Christopher. We'll change the presenter thing here, and off we go.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mark. Do I have it now? Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you all for joining us for this third of 3 webinars dedicated to the use of geographic information systems in DDACTS, data-driven approaches to crime and safety. As we talked about at the very beginning of this process, DDACTS is a strategy that focuses on hotspots. So on the analytical end, it's really important that we're careful and precise about how we identify, define, analyze, and depict crash and crime hotspots. We should understand the variety of different hotspot techniques available to us, and to the extent that we rely on software to identify hotspots, we should at least understand what the software is doing so that we can make the necessary modifications based on the data sets that we want to look at. You know, in the first webinar of the series, we looked at the basics of ArcGIS, about how to navigate around the map and add data and create a base map. And in the second one, we looked at the process of getting dots on the map, whether that was based on existing coordinates within the data set or the need to address match or to geocode. And so in this one, we're going to learn how to turn those dots on the map into hotspots, small geographic areas with large concentrations of crime. Specifically, we are going to cover the different types of hotspots, including geographic aggregation, adaptive scanning, and density mapping. We're going to learn how to use spatial joins in ArcGIS to create point, line, and area aggregations. We're going to use CrimeStat, a separate application that works with ArcGIS. We're going to use its nearest neighbor hierarchical spatial clustering tool to identify clusters of crashes and crimes. We're going to see how density mapping works in both Spatial Analyst and in CrimeStat. And then we're going to turn our hotspots into a target zone layer within ArcGIS and do some supplemental analysis on the points that are within those target zones. Now, I don't really recommend that you try to follow along with the hands-on lessons with me during this webinar. I'm going to be going pretty fast, and if you haven't already taken the time to set up the base maps or to create the point maps that we did last time, then you're going to be starting behind. But you have the files necessary to follow along. And what I would recommend is that you watch the webinar now, and then later on you watch a recording of it again and try to follow along with the data set or with your own data set if you want to at that point. We want to begin by talking about what a hotspot is and why it's important that we understand the different methodologies for creating hotspots. There's no precise specific definition of a hotspot. It's one of those things that you kind of know it when you see it, but it has been defined variously in the ways that are on your screen right now. Anything from a specific location, a single address, a single intersection with a lot of incidents, to an area. And you know, it can be a relatively large area if your total study area is quite large as well. You can try to define it more precisely by saying an area of at least X size in which there are at least Y incidents, or an area that represents no more than X percentage of the territory that you're studying that has no less than Y percentage of the crime. But you would be establishing that definition. That definition doesn't exist in any existing literature. A hotspot is just a concentration of crime or crashes, and it doesn't really get more precise or scientific than that. Now take a look at this this map here. This is just a bunch of dots on a map. That's what we start with when we go about the process of creating our hotspots. We have our points, and by looking at those points, you can kind of see where the concentration of incidents are. But I mean, really, the whole town seems to be covered with dots. It's tough to pick out specific discrete areas that you would say, yes, this is a hotspot, because we have so much data. We've got a couple of years worth, say, of crashes represented on this map right here. A couple of things are happening. I mean, there's too many points, to really draw your eye to individual clusters, but also there could be multiple incidents beneath some of these points. There could be hundreds of them. You can't tell. They all look like one point when you're looking at it from above. And so by simply looking at the dots on the map, we can't really depict the hotspots. We really can't identify the hotspots. We need tools to help us do that. Now take a look at these two different tools that I've put into play here. The top left one is simple aggregation by point. I've simply counted up how many dots, how many incidents are at each point, and depicted the ones that have more with a larger dot. And the second one in the lower right is an adaptive scanning method. This is the output of nearest neighbor hierarchical spatial clustering, and what it does is identifies points that are close together. And you can see the fairly big differences between the two. The one in the upper left emphasizes individual locations that have a lot of incidents. And this would be good if we were trying to literally identify an intersection or parcels or particular businesses that we wanted to concentrate our attention on, maybe for some sort of crime prevention solution. But the one in the lower right emphasizes it doesn't look at particular individual locations. It looks at points that are close together. And this might be more suitable for a patrol-based solution. Let's say like a DDACTS solution. We want to put more officers into the areas that have more points so that they can reduce the crime. This hotspot up here, for instance, in the upper right, is completely invisible on the first map because none of those dots is right on top of each other. Right? There's a bunch of dots in the area, but they're all scattered, and so none of them jumps out as this point has a lot of incidents. I mean, these two clusters right here in the upper right quadrant, which are around here, are de-emphasized in the point symbol map as well. But on the adaptive scanning map, a couple of points that have an awful lot of incidents, even though they do appear within the identified clusters, are really jump forward when we look at it on the map in the upper left. Okay. So two different types of maps for two different purposes, perhaps, both depicting hotspots in different ways. Neither right, neither wrong. Just they have different operational utilities. And that's why it's important to be aware of what the different mapping techniques that we're using is doing with the underlying data. So there are three basic categories of ways that we can create hotspots, and within that first category, there's a number of sub options. The first is what we call geographic aggregation, and that's literally just counting the number of dots within some existing geography or intersecting some existing geography. So the number of dots at a particular point, the number of dots on a particular line, the number of dots within a particular polygon, and just counting them up and displaying the results as the sum of the incidents in those that existing geography. The second is the adaptive scanning method, and it doesn't care about the underlying geography. It just looks for points that are close together. It looks for clusters. And there are a couple of ways we see that we can do that. We can define it ourselves. We'll be able to say either identify any area that has at least 20 dots that is a quarter mile or smaller in radius. Or we can do it based on statistical probability. We can look for statistically significant clusters of points based on what our real data looks like in comparison to a random distribution of the same number of dots across the map. And the third method is the one that's probably the most popular, interpolation or kernel density, which creates those nice color hotspot maps that have, they look nice, but they have their weaknesses, and we'll talk about them when we get into how to do those particular types of maps. So some examples. This is simple geographic aggregation, just counting a bigger dot where there are more points. Here's aggregation by line, which is color coding and increasing the thickness of the line where there are more incidents. So this is, in this particular case, we're looking at burglaries of motor vehicles in Plano, Texas. And there's a bigger line and a different colored line when there are more burglaries along that particular street segment. Here's a aggregation by area, commonly called a choropleth map. Darker color where there are more incidents. But note how this particular type of map obscures where the actual hotspot is. For all we know, that in this neighborhood right here, the major concentration could be up here in the northeast corner, and we lose that specificity by aggregating to the polygon. Similarly, over here, there could be a major hotspot, say right here, where the three neighborhoods come together, but because it's being bisected by three different neighborhoods, none of them gets enough volume to really jump forward in the count, right? And so this works well when there's a reason to use a particularly underlying geography, and it tends to work better with smaller geographies where we can pick out more specific hotspots. And then we can use grids, of course, for geographic aggregation. We can make them very small, so we can overlay a grid on the map and color code the grid cells by the number of points that we find, so that it doesn't have to be as large as the polygons on this map here. And we can do geographic aggregation by buffers as well. So if you wanted to, say, put a buffer around every intersection in your jurisdiction and then count the number of points that it finds within those buffers, you could create a very different sort of looking map, but it would be very intersection focused. Right? And you can do the same thing for certain types of businesses. Count all the number of points found within 1,000 feet of a school or a bar or a public transportation site and color code that appropriately. The choropleth doesn't have to cover the entire map the way that this one does here. You could have polygons that don't necessarily cover the map, some that overlap even, and still color code them based on the number of points that it finds within those buffers. Then we have the adaptive scanning method. As I said, it doesn't really care about what the underlying geography looks like. It's just going to find points that are close together and flag them and put a circle around them, or something that we'll later see is called a convex hull. And we can do a lot with the different settings in this adaptive scanning to change the number of hotspots that we see and the size of those hotspots. And then finally, the choropleth method, which color codes the entire map. Although we often put the lowest values to white or blank, but it color codes the entire map based on the values of incidents that it finds in cells and nearby cells. And just a quick diversion into the way that this particular method works, because if you do it in something like Spatial Analyst, you can do it in 5 minutes without ever really understanding the mechanisms behind it. But the way it works is it puts a grid on top of the map, very small grid. We can specify actually what size the grid cells are, but it only looks good if the grid cells are quite small. So it puts this grid over the top of the map, and here we are zoomed in a little bit on that grid. And then what it does is it counts how many points that it finds within each grid cell and nearby each grid cell. We get to specify what the size of the search radius is. So it's going to put a search radius around the center point of each grid cell. We call that a kernel, and it identifies how many points that it finds within the radius of that kernel. And it's going to give each point a different weight depending on how close it is to the center of the grid cell versus, towards the edges of the search radius. in this particular example down here, it's going to give the most weight to the middle, obviously, and a linearly descending amount of weight method of interpolation. We'll see the other methods coming up in a little bit. So then we color code each grid cell based on the value of the number of points that it weighted with, and as we zoom out, the grid cells start to disappear. We don't see them as much, and it becomes a smoother looking map that helps us identify where our hotspot is. Here's a better example right here. Okay. But there are a lot of pitfalls and things that we have to be aware of when we create these density maps. First of all, based on the settings that we're going to enter, as we'll see, we can make them look very smooth and large hotspots, or we can have a bunch of modeled small hotspots. And the numbers that appear down here are almost always impossible to explain to an audience, which is why people like my colleague Brian Hill, who created this map, computer's going a little bit haywire here. Like my colleague who created this map, changed the legend to say low, average, moderate, high, very high, because the numbers themselves are really difficult to explain. They're an interpolated value based on the proximity of the center point of the grid cell to the incidents that have given it the weight. And you try to say something like that in a ComStat meeting and they're going to look at you strangely. But this is a bit of a lie, because the red area here, the densest area, isn't necessarily very high. It could have one incident. If you only had one incident in your data set, your density mapping routine will happily create a hotspot right around that one incident. And so it doesn't have a lot of objective value. It's more relative to the data set that you've chosen to feed into it. Anyway, we'll look at some specific examples as we get into how to create those particular types of hotspot maps. So let's move over directly to ArcGIS itself and look at how to actually depict our dots as hotspots. As I said from the previous workshops, we've already established our base map, and we've already geocoded our crash data set and our crime data set, so that we can now turn to the process of depicting those crashes and crimes as hotspots. And just a quick word about what data is going in here. Because this is for DDACTS purposes, and DDACTS is a strategy that's focused on highly visible enforcement on police patrols of areas in order to suppress crime. We have put on the map here the types of crimes that are going to be responsive to that visible police presence, right? So in creating my DDACTS crime map, I haven't just put all Part 1 crimes on the map, or all crimes on the map, because a lot of those are going to be interpersonal crimes between people that occur behind closed doors and in a way that a police officer on the street doing traffic stops is simply not going to impact. Unless I can filter out specifically those assaults that occur on the street, I'm probably not going to include assaults or aggravated assaults, or I'm sorry, sexual assaults on my map. I probably won't include fraud or other types of crimes that occur. They don't occur on the street. They don't occur in the outdoors. I won't include employee theft. I'm not going to include. I'm probably not going to include shoplifting, although some agencies have chosen to include it. But it's tough to measure how much shoplifting you actually have, and that tends to overwhelm the map when you have some large retail establishments. But what I am going to put on here are things like burglaries, robberies, auto theft, thefts from vehicles. In cases of agencies that don't have a lot of those more serious crimes, we may look at vandalism. We might look at calls for service that don't even rise to the level of crime if they happen outdoors and there's something of concern to the community. We might look at prowlers, suspicious activity, disorderly conduct, traffic complaints even. I mean, it depends on what the priorities of your particular community are. But it's important to be careful about what data we're putting on the map. We're also not going to just blindly put, say, the last 3 years on there, although we could start with that, but we want to think about what data set is going to be predictive for the time period that we're going to be implementing the DDACTS enforcement. So if we're planning to start, say, April, May, and June of 2018, I'm probably going to select April, May, and June of the previous 3 years, say, instead of the entire calendar year, just because there's seasonal variations in crime that depend on things like when school is in session and what holidays and events are happening around that particular time frame. And so a like time period is usually more predictive of what's going to happen than say a totality of data from some sort of past time period. However, that's not always true, and you might find in your own agency that crime isn't very seasonal, and just looking at the last calendar year is a pretty good prediction of where things are likely to happen in the next quarter. So that's an analysis that you can do for yourselves. Either way, you get your dots in the map, and in this case, I have saved these layers as shapefiles within ArcGIS. These are no longer linked directly to my Access database or an Excel file or something like that. Remember, you can do that if you've got the dots in the map from an Excel file or an Access database link. You can save them as a shapefile by right-clicking on the layer name and then going to Data and then Export Data and choosing to export it as a shapefile. And the advantages are that ArcGIS understands shapefiles better than it understands linked data. And there are certain things that it won't do with linked data, certain selections that it won't do, certain hotspot methods that it won't do. And so it's more useful to make a permanent file out of those points. Also, CrimeStat, which we're about to use to depict hotspots, only works with a permanent file. It won't link to an Access database. So let's start with the easiest one, a graduated symbol map. We want to identify the points, the individual points that have the highest number of incidents here and have a bigger dot where those incidents are. And we can do that a couple of different ways. First of all, let me turn these points off. If I could do the counting within my database and then feed the results over to this to ArcGIS. So if in my database I already group by the X and the Y coordinates and then count the number of incidents that have occurred in each pair of coordinates, all I have to do is display the location of those points based on the X and Y coordinates. We learned how to do this last time. And there they are. But because these aren't individual incidents, but rather a count of how many incidents have occurred at each point, I can go into the properties for that layer. And on the Symbology tab, I can tell it to display the dots as quantities, and specifically as a graduated symbol map with a bigger dot where there are more incidents. I'll make them reddish, and I like to de-emphasize the smaller ones and really emphasize the larger ones, so I'm going to change the symbol range from 2 to 24. And there we go. And so the locations, the individual pairs of coordinates with the most incidents jump out. Now, this is the only method of hotspot mapping that will allow you to maintain a direct link back to your original data and yet still refresh the hotspots based on the changes in that data. The other methods are going to create separate files that we're going to have to recreate if we want to refresh the data. But this particular method, since it's based on a link to the original database, will refresh as the data in that database changes. Now, a couple things to keep in mind, though, with this particular method. It looks like it's a good method, and certainly some points stand out. But as we talked about with the map that I showed you at the beginning, dense clusters of points, like say in this neighborhood here, where they don't actually they're not literally right on top of each other, are de-emphasized with this method of hotspot mapping. You can also get some inconsistent results. I don't have an example particularly on this map, but let's say, for instance, that this large dot here is representing a shopping center that's located in the middle of this parcel, and all of the addresses, all of the businesses at that shopping center share the same address. So because they share the same address, all of their incidents geocode to the same location and therefore have the same coordinates. Now you might have another shopping center somewhere else where it's just as big and it might be, you know, the same size, but each of the points has a different address. And so they all geocode to a slightly different location, and the dots therefore don't directly appear on top of each other. The coordinates aren't exactly the same, and so they don't create one large point when we map it this way. In fact, when you think about it, the only way that this particular method is possible of hotspot mapping is by taking advantage of the inherent inaccuracy in geocoding that we have when we match to the address. Because if we actually knew the specific coordinates of every crime, like if a police officer actually collected them with a GPS device, say, every time he went to a crime scene, you'd almost never get the exact same coordinates in more than one location. I mean, maybe occasionally if two cars got broken into in, say, the same exact parking spot or something like that. But generally speaking, your crimes are always going to be offset a little bit depending on where the victim and the offender were at the time. So if we had real accuracy in geocoding, we would almost never be able to create a map exactly like this. Still, as I said earlier, it's useful when we want to identify individual addresses, or let's say intersections, that have a lot of incidents that are worth our attention. But it might not be the best method for identifying clusters of points for something like directed patrols. So let's move on. Oh, no, actually, before we move on, sorry, let me show you how to create the same sort of map if we don't have the data already prepared for us with the counts. So let's say we were trying to create the same map, but based off the DDACTS crime layer here, in which every dot doesn't have a count, but is an actual individual incident. So how do we create the same sort of density of graduated symbol map? We do that with a tool, which is in the Arc toolbox, called Collect Events. And you'll find it under Spatial Statistics Tools, and then Utilities, and then Collect Events. When you run this tool, it asks you what is your input feature, and that's going to be our DDACTS. I'll do crashes this time, DDACTS crashes. And then where do you want to output the data? And I want to output it to, I'm going to put in my Allen Geo database, say. Despite the error message, I think it's going to work. I'll call it crash hotspots. Okay, something's giving us trouble there, so we'll just put it into the folder as a shapefile. And I hit OK. And it doesn't, it only tells us down in the status bar, but it is running. It just takes a minute. And then it produces the result. Now, the one thing I don't like about this method is it tends to, even though it doesn't make any sense, it tends to by default organize the legend in with decimal numbers, which obviously there are whole numbers at these locations, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I don't like we just have to make some modifications to things like the symbol sizes and the colors and so forth. It's not a huge deal. So I'll change the color. I'll change the symbol size range. And one by one, I'd go in here and change the legends later on. It might be if I choose something other than equal interval, like natural breaks, the legend will make more sense. Yeah, it does here. Okay. And there we go. Okay. So again, this being with crashes, we've identified some intersections that seem to have a lot of crashes. But just keep in mind that clusters of crashes along a particular street or within a particular area are being de-emphasized by focusing on just the literal conflation of those crashes in terms of point here. Okay, let's move on to graduated line maps. And graduated line maps I find work really well with crashes because crashes occur in a linear manner, right? They're not so much a two-dimensional phenomenon where an area has a problem with crashes. They occur along particular street segments. So if we can count up the number of crashes by those street segments, then we can identify those streets that have higher values than others. We're going to do this with a spatial join. And I'm going to do it with a spatial join to my streets layer here. But before I do, I want to point out that in this particular streets layer that I'm using isn't as fragmented as the one that you might be using. So for instance, this, you might have seen that this street segment here is a very long object, whereas in most GIS layers, it would be broken up into much smaller segments in between each intersection. But I'm using some kind of basic data from the US Census Bureau here that doesn't have things split up exactly the way it might for you. You can always download your own data from the Census Bureau and get the exact same results. Well, let's look and see what it looks like, and then I'll talk more about that. So in order to do this type of map, what we need to do is count up how many crashes occur on each segment of road here. So to do that, I'm going to do something called a spatial join. I'm going to join my DDACTS crashes to my streets layer. And so we'll count up how many crashes occur on each street segment. And it's a very simple process. We simply right-click on the layer that we're joining to, in this case, the streets layer. I choose joins and relates, and then join. And there are two types of joins that we can do. By default, it might come up to an attribute join, where we join the two layers together based on some common field that they have. But I don't want to do an attribute join. I want to do a spatial join. And the layer that I'm going to join it to is DDACTS crashes. And down here it says each line will be given a summary of the numeric attributes of the points that are intersected by it or closest to it. I'm going to choose closest to it. That way, if one of these points is slightly off the line, it'll still be joined to the closest street segment. Down here, these are all numeric things that we can do if we have I don't know, let's say we had the property value or the number of people injured in each crash in the underlying data set. We could then get this ArcGIS to calculate the average number of people injured or the maximum or the sum of the people injured on each street segment. But if you don't have that type of numeric data in the underlying data set to calculate, you don't need to click any of those boxes. It's going to do a count of the number of points no matter what you choose here. See, it says a count field will be added showing how many points are intersected or closest, but we can also do this additional math if we want to. But in this case, we don't want to. So I'm just going to move on. I'm going to save my my resulting map as crashes by street and hit OK. And it goes through the process of counting how many points are occurring on each street segment. It then creates a layer, it just did up here, crashes by street, that looks exactly like the existing street layer. In fact, you didn't even notice it get added to the map because all it did was appear on top of the existing street layer. And in fact, it has all of the attributes of the street layer, except it also has this new attribute at the end called count. And by sorting by this field, we can see that the number one street segment, West McDermott Drive, has 136 collisions. And so how do we depict that on the map itself? Let me turn off the dots. Well, we can do it with color, or we can do it with size, or we can do it with both. I'm colorblind, so I tend to do things with graduated symbols rather than colors. So if I go into the properties of my crashes by street layer, I can tell it I want to do a graduated symbol map based on the count of incidents along each street segment. And then I just have to tell it how big to make the segments. Let's make it from 0.5 to 8. And I'm actually going to tell it, don't even bother to show me if it just has 0 to 5. I only want to start to see it when it gets a little bit higher. So let's see how that looks. There we go. So we can see that this particular segment here has a lot of collisions. This one here has a lot of collisions. There's a few others that stand out. And the rest of them are, especially most of these residential streets, are just regular streets. Now, one neat thing that we can do with this data, because you notice that some of these street segments are longer than others, so the count seems a little bit unfair because this is a really long segment. Well, one of the things we can do is normalize the count by the length of the street segment, which is already calculated for us in the attribute data as shape length. And given those numbers, that has to be in miles. It really doesn't matter what it is, it's going to scale the same way. So if we normalize it by the shape length, we'll end up with a calculation of the number of crashes per mile, I guess, in this case. And that tempered things a little bit. That one original segment doesn't look so bad anymore, and a couple of other ones jump to the forefront. Now, if these numbers are hard to explain, you can also always do the calculations within the data set. So if for instance, within the attribute table. So if I wanted to verify that this shape length was in fact miles, I could right click on the column here and tell it to calculate geometry, and specifically to calculate the length, which for some reason is disabled. Oh, because my data frame is in decimal degrees. It can't calculate the length based on that. I'd have to reproject it. So I apologize. I won't recalculate the shape length, but I could add a field that says crashes per mile. And then use the field calculator to do a calculation right here. Count divided by length. And then I could base the symbology on that calculated field with no normalization. Okay. It doesn't change anything, but it allows me to fine tune how these numbers appear. So I could do the crashes per 1,000 square feet or per 10,000 square feet or something like that. Whereas with the normalization, you have to take what it gives you, and you can't change those numbers. So either way, it's an unconventional looking type of map, but it's particularly useful for things that occur in a more linear manner. And as I say, if you can work with your GIS department to create more useful links of the street segments, that's the best way to go about it. Right now, these are a bit too long, and I really want to separate these into shorter blocks, but probably not to the level where there's a segment in between every intersection, because you'd end up with some very tiny segments, like right here. I'd have a couple of segments in between these two streets, that might be a little bit too much. So your GIS department can help you join small segments together or split large segments in order to create a more meaningful geography for this type of mapping. And the third method that we'll take a look at is, adaptive scanning. Now, if we had a polygon layer, if we had like neighborhoods or police beats or something like that, the process of creating the choropleth map is the same as creating this line map. We do a spatial join to the polygon layer from the point layer. And I'm going to cover that in a little bit, but I don't have an existing polygon layer to work with, so we'll put a pin in that and come back to that in just a second. So we'll move on to adaptive scanning, and this involves using a tool outside ArcGIS, really extraordinarily useful tool called CrimeStat. CrimeStat is a application that was commissioned by the National Institute of Justice starting in the late 1990s. It was written by a Houston-based academic and programmer named Ned Levine, and it's been updated a few times since it was originally commissioned, most recently, I think, in 2014. I don't think there are plans to keep it going in the future, which is really too bad because it does some extraordinary stuff, and I hope somebody finds some funding somewhere to make CrimeStat, or at least the principles of CrimeStat, live. But until it disappears, I mean, it's still going to be useful until it simply won't run anymore, and that's going to be many years away with different iterations of Windows or something like that. So we'll still be able to use the current version for a lot of years. CrimeStat doesn't display any maps, but what it does is it takes data that's already been geocoded in ArcGIS or any GIS system. It does some useful routines on them, and then it exports the data into a format that we can then bring in to our GIS system. And there are uses for it in tactical analysis, in intelligence analysis. I mean, you can see all the different tabs here, and there are just a ton of different routines that it runs. Some of them are useful to crime analysts. Others are useful only to criminologists or academics. Basically, what Ned tried to do in creating this application is bring together all of the spatial statistics that were being used in crime analysis or criminology at the time in one place where they could be offered for free, because it's a free application, and anybody could run them on any data set. There are some proprietary formulas out there that he wasn't able to include, but generally speaking, he got most of what we need to do things like journey to crime analysis, spatial forecasting, and hotspot identification for the purposes of what we're doing here. And if you want to learn more about CrimeStat and the different routines that it does, I would refer you to the handbook here that is in the handouts group that you can download. It's a workbook that Susan Hammond and I wrote a number of years ago. It's meant for crime analysts, and it walks you through the principles of CrimeStat and how to use it to do pretty much all of the routines in it that would be useful to crime analysts. So we're going to focus on just one for the purposes of this webinar, and that's called Nearest Neighbor Hierarchical Spatial Clustering, abbreviated NNH. But that's a great term. Use that in a ComStat meeting and watch the eyes of the people in the room light up and think, wow, this person needs a raise. Nearest Neighbor Hierarchical Spatial Clustering. And what it does is identifies hotspots. It identifies clusters of incidents, either based on random probability or based on what we put in as the definition that we want to give to a hotspot. It all starts here on the data setup screen, where we indicate where the data is coming from. So what's the primary that we want it to calculate hotspots on? And I'm going to load in the DBase file, the DBF file, that's associated with my DDACTS crime layer. Remember, the DBase file is which includes the X and Y coordinate. Okay. So I load it in the DBase file for the DDACTS crime shapefile, and I tell it which fields have the X and Y coordinates. And if any of those fields have blank values or missing values, I can specify that here, but in this case, I ensured that they didn't before I brought them over to the map in the first place. You also have to be very careful about specifying the type of coordinate system that you're using, specifically whether it's projected or whether it's regular latitude longitude. In our case, as you can see, it's latitude longitude, right? Negative values for the X, the longitude, because we're in the Western Hemisphere. And obviously, none of these values are greater than 180 for the X, and none of them are greater than 90 for the Y. And there's a lot of decimal points. So that's a good indication that we're looking at latitude, longitude. If we were looking at state plane coordinates, they'd all be positive, and they'd be in the hundreds of thousands of integers here. Where am I? Okay, so latitude, longitude. And now I'm going to go over to the spatial description, the hotspot analysis tab. And I'm going to choose nearest neighbor hierarchical spatial clustering. Now there are two types of NNH analysis that we can do with these dots. The first one is random nearest neighbor distance. And the way this works is it basically figures out, all right, you got all these dots in the map. If these dots were distributed randomly across the map, what would be the expected mean distance between each dot and its closest neighbor? And then this routine will look for points that are closer than that, significantly closer than that, depending on where we specify on this search radius. Right, and it will identify those particular clusters. Now, because we don't care about clusters that are smaller than, so we probably don't care if there's two incidents that are closer together than you'd expect on the basis of random probability. I'm not going to use that two incidents to recommend extra deployment in an area. We can set a minimum value per cluster here. Now, the problem with the random distance, even though it is based on statistical probability, is the more dots you have on the map, the smaller the distance has to be between them before the routine will consider them statistically significant. So even if I increase the ellipse size to 2 standard deviations, when I go to save my result, status bar for this particular routine isn't very useful. It just kind of flies back and forth. So it found a lot of clusters with at least 10 incidents. Let me increase that to 20 just so it'll be a more manageable number. Okay, this time it only found 22 clusters. Now, what I just did was I told it to save the ellipses to a file called DDACTS crime. Anytime you specify a name in CrimeStat for where you want to save something, it always puts a prefix in front of that, indicating what routine it ran. In this case, it'll put the prefix NNH in front of it to show that it ran the nearest neighbor hierarchical spatial clustering routine. So I'll find that file now in my Allen folder. If I refresh, okay, there it is. NNH1, NNH2. I'll explain the difference in a second. DDACTS crime. Before I can bring these over to the map, I have to assign a projection to them because it's not the same as the projection used by the data frame here. CrimeStat doesn't assign a projection to your to the files that it creates because it doesn't know what the projection is. All it knows is it's either projected or spherical, but it doesn't know the specific projection you're using. It doesn't know the specific coordinate system you're using. And so if it's not the same as the coordinate system used by the data frame, you've got to tell it in the catalog window here what coordinate system that data has used. So I go into properties, and I'm going to tell it, because it's part of my favorites already, yep, that uses WGS 1984. Same with the second one. And now when I drag it over, the ellipses will appear on the map. Now, there's a couple of odd things happening here. The fairly large ellipses that you're seeing let me back up a second. The way that it creates the ellipses, it identifies the points that it thinks are part of the hotspot. It then calculates the mean center of those points and then the standard deviation of the coordinates, and then creates an ellipse, either, depending on what we specified, either 1, 1.5, or 2 standard deviations away from the mean center. However, if all of the points that make up a hotspot are at the same location as they are in all of these locations where you can see a fairly large ellipse, okay, you can see one dot in the center of these. This one looks like it has more, but it's just a matter of the ellipse picking up these extra ones. Really, it's all based on the one in the center there. If all of the points occur at one location, then the ellipse tends to be pretty large, because it technically shouldn't exist at all. If they're all at one location, there is no standard deviation, and so you wouldn't even see the resulting shape. So in order to accommodate that, Ned Levine programmed in a minimum size of the ellipse. So in all these cases, all of the points that make up the ellipse are right in the middle. The places that you're not noticing so easily are ones like this. In these areas, the points that make up the ellipse are within the ellipse. And so here, the ellipse is 2 standard deviations of the coordinates that make up the points around the mean center. The ellipse is a very abstract object. In some data sets, it looks nicer than the alternative, which I'll show you in a minute. But in other cases, you get some weird results, like over here, where I can't account for why this ellipse is so odd shaped. I think it literally it might be picking up one of the dots off to the side here as part of the same cluster, and therefore elongating it like this when it seems to only be surrounding those particular points here. But again, the ellipse is an abstract shape. It doesn't literally surround all of the dots that make up the cluster. It could surround additional dots, and it might not surround every one, especially depending on the size. So the larger you make it, the more likely that you're going to be picking up extra territory. And the smaller you make it, the more likely that you're not going to actually see all the dots that it encompasses, which is why there's a useful alternative to the ellipse called a convex hull. A convex hull is a polygon that literally just connects the outer edges of the points that it thinks makes up the hotspot. And same thing, having created those, I now have to, it puts the prefix C and an H in front of them. And now I've got to just go tell it what the coordinate system is. Pull that over. All right, now we've got an odd situation going here because it literally just thinks it's those 2 points. So I'm not sure how the ellipse ended up being so wonky in this particular case. Well, let's see if we can find an alternative location where you can see the difference better between the convex hull and the ellipse. Down here, I suppose, is a good example. All right, so the mathematics behind the scenes thinks that this is the hotspot surrounding these points. but the ellipse, since it calculates the mean center, then a standard deviation, creates a more, again, abstract object that doesn't literally surround the points, but it's kind of close. I'm not saying don't use the ellipses. I'm just saying you have to understand what it's doing. Anyway, the problem we're seeing here on this map in general is that these hotspots are simply too small. Because there's so many dots in the map, it has to find points that are really close together to establish statistical significance of the proximity of those points. And so a more useful way of doing nearest neighbor hierarchical spatial clustering is to, if we don't care about statistical probability and we simply want to identify our top volume locations, is to use the fixed distance method here and tell it, we're going to define what a hotspot is. And I'm going to say a hotspot is any place with a 0.25 mile radius, so a quarter-mile radius, that has at least 25 incidents. And I'll compute that. It'll overwrite the old ones. So the crime stat, when it runs the routine, it always brings up this results window, and you can sort of scan the results window to see what happened. But in order to really, obviously see the results, you have to bring them into ArcGIS. But this tells me that it found 32 clusters. That's quite a few. That's a lot of hotspots. So I'm probably going to change the parameters a little bit. But let me refresh. And now we can see that kind of a chaos everywhere where we get both the ellipses and the convex hulls representing our clusters. I really think convex hulls look nicer in many ways, so I'm going to turn off the ellipses and just focus on the convex hulls. And now it's identified clusters of points within a quarter-mile radius where there's at least 25 incidents of crime. Now, as I said, that's quite a few. So I might go back here and either lower the search radius or increase the minimum number of points. Let's try 35 incidents. Still found quite a few. I found 20 clusters of at least 35 incidents within a quarter-mile radius. And there they are. Now, I can also prioritize these hotspots because in the resulting layer, there's a frequency field that indicates the total number of incidents that occur within that particular hotspot. So I could go into the properties for this convex hull layer and tell it to use that frequency to use a different color for the hotspots. Now if I turn off my dots, I can see it a little bit better. So there are my crime hotspots throughout the city of Allen. That's a quick tutorial in crime stat. There's so much more that you need to know about it. But again, I refer you to that workbook, which really walks you through everything step by step in how to create these different points, these different hotspots, and all the other routines that crime stat does. Please check it out. It's an enormously useful application that deserves wider adoption among crime analysts. It does a lot of things that other applications do, including like this mode method here simply counts up the number of points at each pair of coordinates. The same thing that we did earlier with collect events. So there's some routines in here that it replicates, but for nearest neighbor hierarchical spatial clustering, I don't know any other application, commercial, non-commercial, in ArcGIS, out of ArcGIS, that does the exact same thing that CrimeStat does. So for that routine alone, it's definitely worth the effort. Okay, let's move on to density mapping, which creates what I like to call risk surface rather than a literal hotspot map, because it's going to assign a color, it's going to assign a value to every point on the map, regardless of whether there was an incident at that point or not. For instance, this field here, right, this large open area that has no streets in the middle of the jurisdiction, is going to get color associated with it. It's going to get a value associated with it, even though by definition no crashes could occur there, and very few crimes could occur here. But based on the proximity of where crimes and crashes have occurred, it's going to get some value to all of those locations in the middle of these empty parcels. Right? So it's more of, as I say, a risk surface based on the proximity to where crimes or crashes have happened, rather than a literal depiction of the number of offenses that it has had, which in this case is, as we can see, none at all. So let's check it out. There is a way to create a density map with an add-on to ArcGIS called Spatial Analyst, and you may have it or you may not have it depending on whether your city or county has chosen to purchase it for you. If you have, if it has purchased it for you, you will find it under in your toolbox under Spatial Analyst Tools, and then Density. Now you're going to see this even if you haven't purchased it, but when you double click on kernel density, if instead of this dialog box you get an error message saying you don't own the tool, then you'll know that your city or county has not purchased it. However, before you despair, make sure you go to the Customize ribbon and choose Extensions. And make sure Spatial Analyst is turned on here, because even if you've purchased it, if you haven't turned it on here, then it won't run. All right, so make sure that this is checked before you try to run Spatial Analyst the first time. So density map and then kernel density. It asks us what feature we want to base the kernel density on. I'm going to choose DDACTS crime. The population field is if you had a field that you wanted to use for weighting, or for a denominator for the number of incidents, we could do that here, but we don't have anything in our particular our data set. The output location is just where it's going to save the resulting raster. I would normally save it in my Allen geodatabase, but there's for some reason some error coming up with that, so I'll go ahead and save it in the default geodatabase. The output cell size is simply a cosmetic setting that indicates the size of the grid cell, and the smaller that we make this, the smoother the resulting map is going to look. The larger we make it, the more pixelated it's going to look. It really just affects the speed of the routine and the cosmetic appearance of the map. I usually accept the default in Spatial Analyst. The search radius is also an important setting that indicates the size of the kernel, so to speak, that we're putting around every one of these cells that's being created. And it's almost, there's no like uniformly accepted academic way to determine what the search radius is. There's been some proposals, but nothing that's purely objective. In some ways, it's a logical question, or that it's asking based on the type of crime that you're analyzing, for what radius around where the crime actually occurred should it be extending influence on the community? And that's a question that's going to have a different answer for something like street robbery versus, say, commercial robbery, or crashes for that matter. And we'll see the results in just a bit. I'm gonna put nothing in there to start with and accept the defaults. I don't remember how it does the default, but we'll see what it comes up with, and then we can tweak this afterwards. Okay, so I'll just accept the defaults, which frankly is what I think most analysts do. Hit OK. And it put the map underneath everything else, so I'm going to drag it up. Well, there it is. Now, what most analysts will do is they'll change it to a color ramp that they like better. So I'll do something like that. And then they might change it so the initial couple of categories has no color associated with it. Okay. So your attention is drawn just to where the actual hotspots are. Even though every area on the map has a value, you don't necessarily have to see every single value, right? Let's see how that compares with the hotspot map that so it picked up the larger ones along this major route here, but it doesn't have a lot of color for some of the smaller ones. But I can tweak that in the various settings. We can get that to happen. Right now, it looks like it's being heavily influenced on a couple of locations where there's a lot of dots at one particular location rather than identifying clusters. So the search radius by default must have been pretty small in this example. Now, to show an alternative, let me go over to CrimeStat, which this is the free alternative if you don't have Spatial Analyst, which also does spatial density mapping on the Spatial Modeling tab. But in order for it to do this, I'm going to have to tell it the coordinates that I want it to use for the map. It doesn't figure that out automatically the way Spatial Analyst does, and that's set up here on the reference file subtab of the data setup main tab. So I need to tell it the coordinates of the lower left and the upper right of my jurisdiction, so it knows how big to make the resulting density map. Zoom out a bit. So the way I typically do that is just to use the drawing toolbar here, which you can turn on under Customize Toolbars, Drawing. And I'm going to use that to draw a box around the city. And then if I double click on the box, on the Size and Position tab, I can see what the coordinates are at the lower left and the upper right. And I just need to copy those values into CrimeStat here. So the lower left is negative 96.7364. And the Y is 33.0698. And then for the upper right, we've got negative 6.6076 and 33.1576. Now, once I've done that, I can save those coordinates as Allen. So I'll never have to do this part again. If I just need to load them, I can just do load and load Allen into this area. So I don't need this box anymore. Now down here, this is the same thing as in Spatial Analyst, where we tell it what's the size of the what size do we want to make the cells. And again, it just matters for how long it's going to take the routine to run and what the thing is going to look like. Because CrimeStat offers the option, I usually do it by number of columns rather than specific cell size. I don't really know sometimes the size of the jurisdiction I'm working with, but if I tell it 300 columns, that's good. In a square jurisdiction, that's going to create 300 columns and 300 rows, so about 990,000 cells. And if that looks too pixelated when I'm done, I can increase this. Having set this up, over on Spatial Modeling, I'll tell it to do a single kernel density estimate. And you can see I have more options here than I have in Spatial Analyst, including the method of interpolation, which I'll let you read about in the handout because it takes a long time to explain these. But this is basically how it weighs the incidents that it finds towards the edges of the radius versus the ones that it finds in the middle of the radius. And I'm pretty sure that Spatial Analysts use a quartic choice of interpolation by default. We always want to use a fixed interval bandwidth in doing this in CrimeStat. Adaptive changes the size of the radius around every cell until it finds a minimum number of points. And that's good for estimating, say, temperature or something like that, but it's not good for this type of mapping where we want to use a uniform size of the search radius around every cell. So I tell it to do a fixed interval, And then again, it's a question of, all right, for the type of crime that we're studying here, what's a sensible interval, a size, a search radius around each cell? How far from where the crime actually happened should we be extrapolating its influence across the map? I'm just going to do half a mile to start with here. And then I'll save the result as a shapefile called DDACTS crime. It's going to put a K in front of that to indicate it's doing a density map. Okay. Takes a little bit longer than it does in Spatial Analyst. That's one advantage of Spatial Analyst, is the speed. And the second advantage, as we're going to see, is when this is done, it's not automatically going to assign colors or a scale to the colors. We have to do that manually. So that finishes. I close. I head over to my folder. Now I've got a new layer called K DDACTS crime. Again, I have to tell it what projection it's using if it's not the same as my data frame. And once I've done that, I can drag it in. And it's going to put a grid over the top of my city, which I can then go in and tell it to symbolize those grid cells using quantities. I'm going to do a graduated color. That color amp looks great to me right there, based on the Z field, which has the weight of each one of those cells. You get an error message here about the maximum sample size, and in order to fix this, you're going to have to go to classify and then sampling and add a couple of zeros to the maximum sample size. And unfortunately, you got to do that every time. There's no way to set that by default. So having changed that, I'm going to set it to none and then back to Z again to reclassify. There we go. And now it will color code each grid cell based on the value of the cell. One thing that I'm going to do is go back to here, the symbology, and tell it to turn off. So I'm going to choose properties for all symbols. And I'm going to tell it to why is it not come up? Well, for some reason the appropriate dialog isn't coming up, so I'll have to do it for every one. But I want to tell it I don't want to see an outline around any of these colors. I just want to see the color. So I don't need to see the outline of the grid. Then it looks a little bit nicer. Okay, so see what I mean about sort of pixelated? You can actually see the edges of the individual grid cells even at this zoom level. So if I set the value here to use more columns, it's not going to change the way the map looks, but it will make it a little bit less pixelated, and yet it will take longer to run. So you just have to find the right balance between those different variables. Now, this is a pretty smooth map. It's identified some obvious hotspots, the same ones that Spatial Analyst identified as the top locations, and a few others as having some incidents going on. But by simply changing something like the search radius to say 1/4 mile instead of a 1/2 mile, I can radically change what the resulting map looks like. And this is true of Spatial Analyst as well. So what we ought to get here is a more modeled map that breaks up these larger hotspots into smaller individual ones. And it might not even look as attractive in some ways. And yet it might be more precise. We'll see what it looks like. Okay, saved over the old one. Because the values are all different now, I've got to go back into the symbology here and recalculate them. Yeah, and so as I said, it created a map of much smaller hotspots and more precise ones. Now, which of the two maps is more accurate is almost a philosophical question. They both have different values for how they're weighting the risk of crime in the various cells on the map. And I can't say for sure that weighing the risk based on a search radius of a quarter mile is less accurate or more accurate than weighing the risk based on a half a mile. There isn't a lot of science out there to help guide us into those particular decisions. But I will say for something like traffic collisions, I just don't like this type of mapping because it turns something that happens at a specific location for a specific reason into a risk surface that will cover areas that simply don't have any additional risk of traffic collisions. All right, so if we go back to looking at our crashes, I realize this density map was based on crime, but let's pretend for a second. So these crashes occurred along this particular street segment, and there's only any risk of these crashes along this particular street segment. The risk does not extend in a two-dimensional way into the fields and parcels and parking lots surrounding that street segment. There's a reason that it happened exactly where it did. So this map is very misleading, I think, if we were using it for traffic collisions, especially if we used a bigger search radius and we ended up with a larger hotspot. This hotspot is suggesting that the highway here has the same risk as this local street, and plainly it doesn't because there are no crashes on the highway, whereas there are crashes on the local street here, right? So we got to be careful about density mapping depending on the type of activity that we're mapping. Burglary, sure. If a burglary happened here, the whole neighborhood was at risk. So it certainly makes sense to put that, use a density map for something like burglary. But for traffic crashes, I'd rather see something else for crashes rather than density mapping. All right, I'm getting way too behind in my material, so I apologize. So let's move ahead. Regardless of what method we use, we should end up at the end with hotspot maps for crime and hotspot maps for crashes. And I'm going to go ahead and use my graduated symbol map for crashes and my nearest neighbor map for crime. And so the conflation of these two ought to help us identify those locations where it might make sense to do our extra traffic enforcement and reduce crime and crashes at the same time. And we can see a few places where clearly there's an overlap between the two. We've got a couple of major hotspots here of crashes right in the middle of a crime hotspot. Here's another one right here. We up here, even though it's smaller. And we have other areas where there's a maybe crime hotspots close to crash hotspots. Let's take a look at this area. So there's a crime hotspot in this neighborhood here, and there aren't really any crashes in the neighborhood, but there are crashes on the streets around it. And so by doing enforcement on these streets, we might be able to influence the traffic going into this neighborhood, as well as reducing crashes on the streets where we're doing the enforcement. So they don't have to be literally right on top of each other in order to designate this as a target area where we're trying to influence both activities at the same time. So to create a target zone out of our hotspots, we literally are going to draw on the map the areas that we want to affect with our DDACTS enforcement. And to do that, we have to have our drawing toolbar turned on. So that's under Customize, Toolbars, Draw. And that creates this toolbar here where we can draw a variety of different polygons, lines, or markers. I'm going to use this polygon tool. We'll zoom in a bit here. And we're going to say, now I'm doing this in consultation with the patrol officers, with patrol supervisors, with the commanders, right? I've done the hotspot analysis, but now we want to get together, have a meeting, look at the results of the analysis, and then determine what areas we truly want to affect. And the operations folks are going to have insights into where to draw the lines that you might not have as an analyst. So we've decided we're going to try to affect a rectangle, basically, around this area. With our DDACTS enforcement. And that's one. And then this area, say, a little bit more complicated. We're going to exclude this road here because it doesn't seem to have a lot of activity going on. But we want to pick up the related areas of the highway and some of the local roads around it. That looks good. And then I'll do a third one over here. Let's just say we want to get this whole neighborhood here. Those are our 3 target zones. Okay. Now, right now, these are just cosmetic objects that I've drawn on top of the map, right? But if I want to save these as my DDACTS target zones. So I'm going to go to the drawing toolbar and the menu here that you get when you click on drawing and choose convert graphics to features. And I definitely want to say I don't want to just include selected graphics. I have this one selected, but I want to do all of them. Right. And I'll save them in my DDACTS folder and call it target zones. And I'm going to check this box that says automatically delete graphics after conversion, meaning it will delete the cosmetic ones and just leave the layer that I'm about to create. Do you want to add the exported data to the map as a layer? Yes, I do. And having done so, I'm going to symbolize it so I can see this a little bit better. I don't need to fill it in with anything, but I'm going to make a nice thick outline. There we go. So there's my 3 DDACTS target areas. And those target areas are labeled. They have 0, 1, and 2. And to give them a name, I'm going to use my field calculator to say, call this each area zone plus the FID number plus 1. So these will be, instead of 0, 1, and 2, they're going to get named zone 1, 2, and 3. Oh, something went amiss there. I might want to use a single quote here rather than a double quote. Well, I've forgotten how to write expressions, apparently. Maybe I wanted an ampersand. I should have tested this before I did it in a live webinar. I apologize. There we go. Okay, ampersand rather than a plus. All right, so we got zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3 now for my three DDACTS zones. I can label them as such. And more importantly now, so I can analyze what's happening within these zones. I want to assign the appropriate zone to each of the crimes and the crashes that occur within them. Now I can do that quite easily with, again, a spatial join. So in this case, I'm going to join the DDACTS target area, or no DDACTS target area, as the case may be, to the crime and the crash layer. So I'm going to right-click on DDACTS crime, joins and relates, join. I have absolutely no idea what those error messages are about. This version of ArcGIS is Giving me all kinds of trouble. Looks like maybe it's going to allow me to do it anyway. So I don't know what those error messages are about. But anyway, I'm going to join based on a spatial location. I'm going to join based on the target zones. What is with this? And each point will be given the attributes of the polygon that it falls inside. That's what I want. I will save the output as a shapefile. I'll call it crimes by zone, or crimes with zone. Despite the error messages, it seems to have worked okay. And so now I get a new file that has all of my crime data that I had before, but a field at the end that has the name of the DDACTS zone that it's in. Now, most of them aren't in a zone, but if I scroll down, I should ultimately, there we go, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. Okay. And what I can do now is bring this resulting, the DBase file that it just created, along with that new layer, I can bring that into Microsoft Access. Crimes with zone. Oh, it's not going to. Sorry about that. I always forget Access will not recognize DBase files with names greater than 8 characters. I don't know why, but that's a limitation. So we've got to call it something like CWZ that has less than 8 characters. I should have thought about that when I named the original file to begin with. I apologize. I can bring that into Access. Here it is. And now I can use all of the tools that you learned in the Microsoft Access lessons to analyze things about the crimes that are happening in my DDACTS target zones, including, for instance, why don't I cross-tabulate the type of crime and the zone that it's in. Okay. And the greater than and less than symbol here are means that it's not in as a DDACTS target zone, right? These are my control incidents, right? So here we go. This DDACTS zone, zone 1 and 2 seem to have a big problem with burglaries from vehicles. Zone 3 has a slightly lesser problem with them, but it's still got quite a few. Zones 1 and 2 have a lot of problems with theft. Zone 2, this particular type of theft, and so forth. And I can drill down by hour of day of the week. And the neat thing is, even if the data that I need, like say the property stolen, isn't part of the data set that I brought over to ArcGIS, no problem. Now that I've got this back in my database, I can just drag in any additional tables that I need, link them by the case number, and do any supplementary analysis that I need on the crimes that are within a particular DDACTS zone. So I'll refer you to the Access lessons for more about how to query. But by bringing the data from ArcGIS with the DDACTS zone back into Access or Excel, I can drill down and now I can tell my officers not just that this is our target zone, but what specific crimes were happening there, what time of day, what day of the week, what types of vehicles are involved, what types of offenders and victims are involved, what types of property are being stolen, etc. So they know more than just where to go. They know what types of activity to look for while they're in that area. The ability to identify which crimes are in which zones is also going to be vital after we've been doing enforcement for a few months, and I want to evaluate how we're doing. So what I can just do at that point is bring in like 5 years of all my data, all my crimes, and the data that I use to evaluate doesn't have to be the same data that I use to create the hotspots to begin with. So I can bring in everything over for the last 5 years use the spatial join that we just did to identify which zone each crime is in, or no zone at all, and then bring that back over to Access or Excel to calculate how things changed after DDACTS enforcement within our zones and within the area that was not represented by a zone, so that I can compare what's happening in my zones to what's happening in my control areas. That's all done with that spatial join. It would just be a bigger data set that we'd be doing that join on. And then I do the same thing with crashes, of course. I'm sorry for that rushed ending a little bit. I spent more time on something else than I had intended to, but I hope that at least gives you the tools that you need to move forward with your hotspot identification, and then later your evaluation. So before I wrap up here, I'll just take any questions. If anybody wants to type any questions into the box or relay them to Mark Domicio.
Well, we'll see if any questions come up here. Anybody raising their hand out there? Well, okay. I am not seeing any.
All right, well, very good. Well, so we've covered a lot of things and quite quickly, so this is definitely one to rewatch. But we looked at the different types of hotspots. We looked at how to create those different types of hotspots, starting with spatial joins in ArcGIS and the collect events tool, how to use CrimeStat's nearest neighbor hierarchical spatial clustering tool, and then we looked at the CrimeStat and spatial analyst density mapping routines to create density maps. And then we looked at drawing our target layers in ArcGIS and saving them, and identifying the points that are within those target zones so that we can do some further analysis and evaluation. I would like everybody from the state of Texas in particular to remember that you are entitled to technical assistance to go along with your DDACTS implementation. So if you need me to work with you directly on any of the hotspot identification and analysis methods that we've looked at during this webinar, that's certainly something that I can do, or any of the other analytical SMEs that might have come to your area. You simply need to contact me or Dan Howard on the when I bring up this, I'll bring up my information again in just a second. Still no questions, so I'll wrap up. So as we talked about at the beginning, data-driven approaches to crime and traffic safety depends entirely on the effective, timely, and detailed identification, prediction, and analysis of crash and crime hotspots. And through enforcement and prevention solutions, our goal is to abate those hotspots, ideally to disperse them around or disperse them to the point that they have no more risk of crashes or crime than any other part of your jurisdiction, so that there are no really any hotspots when we're all done. That would be the ideal outcome of the DDACTS approach. Your patrol officers, your traffic officers, your crime prevention officers should use your maps and your analysis of the target areas to make effective tactical and strategic decisions. But it all starts with your ability to query your data, navigate your geography, get dots on the map, turn them into hotspots, and describe what's happening in those hotspots. So I hope that the 3 webinars that we've had with ArcGIS and the 3 that we had with Access gave you the tools that you need to ask those questions about your data, to represent the data on the map, and to identify and analyze your hotspots. Please don't hesitate to call me or anybody else involved in the DDACTS program if you have any questions or you need any technical assistance. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and attention this afternoon.
And thank you, Christopher. I'll go ahead and take the presentation back now and take care of the last little bit of details here before we get going. Those of you that are taking a look right now in your chat box, I sent you a link to both Christopher's email address and also Dan Howard's email address. Dan is the Text.DDACTS program manager for iAtlas. As always, the opinions contained in the program are those of the creators and don't necessarily reflect the official position of TextDot. You can find out more about some information related to training, coordination, lesson plans, and all that by going to the National Law Enforcement Academy Resource Network site at www.nlearn.org. It is a great resource for trainers and criminal justice personnel looking for lessons. Again, here's the information for Dan, and I also sent that to you in the chat box. Right now we are on hold with the National DDACTS program, but it should be coming back up soon. We've got our applications into NHTSA for a new grant for this, and pretty soon we should be back up and running with that. When that happens, Peggy Schaefer, the National DDACTS program coordinator, will be able to help you out. They offer 3-day free open enrollment classes around the country, and then the 1-day agency-specific classes if your agency has a specific need. And there is a small fee for that just covers our expenses. This was the third of the series. We want to thank you all for being here, and again, if you could take the time to take the short survey, that is at the link that I show you on the screen now, and as we speak, I'm going to go ahead and send that to you in the chat box. And the next and most important is to how to take the test. There's the link again, and once again, everybody take a look at the chat box right now, and you should see magically popping up the information to take the test. Again, you have 24 hours from right now to take it. After that, the system shuts off and you can't take the test anymore. The course is certified through the AtLAS National Certification Program and is accepted for continuing education credits toward your annual in-service training requirement in 35 states, including the states of Texas. And so we appreciate all the work that's gone into making sure that this is an NCP certified course. And with that, we do want to thank you for the attendance. Again, if there is anything that the staff can do for you, please reach out to us. If you have any other ideas about webinars you would like to see, please contact Dan to give him your ideas so we know what to ask for next time. Please be safe, and we'll see you next time.